Think about the last time you watched someone speak in public and thought, wow, that person owns the room. They weren't necessarily the smartest person there. They didn't have the fanciest slides. They didn't read from a script. But every single person in that audience was locked in, leaning forward, hanging on every word. Now think about the last time you had to speak in front of people. Maybe it was a work presentation, a toast at a wedding, a pitch to a client, or just an impromptu comment in a meeting. And somewhere between opening your mouth and finishing your first sentence, something went wrong. Your voice got quieter. Your hands didn't know where to go. You said more times than you said actual words. And when it was over, you sat down and thought, I had so much more to say. Here's the brutal truth that nobody tells you: public speaking is not a talent. It's not something you're born with. It's not reserved for politicians, TED speakers, or extroverts who've never felt nervous a day in their lives. Public speaking is a skill, and like every skill, it can be learned, trained, and mastered with the right tools and the right approach. The problem is that most people either never learn those tools, or they learn the wrong things. They're told to just be confident, which is about as helpful as telling someone who can't swim to just float. They're told to imagine the audience in their underwear, which, besides being deeply weird, does absolutely nothing for your delivery. They practice in front of a mirror and wonder why they still freeze on stage. The advice out there is either too vague, too theatrical, or completely disconnected from how real communication actually works. This video is going to change that. Over the next hour, we're going to break down public speaking into its real, concrete, trainable components. You're going to learn why your brain goes into panic mode the moment you step in front of an audience, and exactly how to rewire that response. You're going to discover the structural secrets that make some speeches impossible to forget and others impossible to remember. You're going to learn how the world's best speakers use silence, pacing, and storytelling not as decoration, but as their most powerful weapons. And by the end of this video, you will have a completely different relationship with the idea of standing up and speaking. Not because I'm going to motivate you with a pep talk, but because once you understand how this actually works, the fear starts to look a lot more like fuel. So whether you're preparing for the biggest presentation of your career, trying to become a better leader, or just tired of feeling invisible in rooms where your ideas deserve to be heard, this one's for you. Let's get into it. Why we fear public speaking, and how to use that fear as fuel. Let's start with the moment nobody talks about honestly, the moment right before you speak. Your heart is doing something that feels less like beating and more like trying to escape your chest. Your mouth goes dry. Your palms are wet. Your mind, which 10 minutes ago was perfectly clear, suddenly feels like a browser with 47 tabs open and no Wi-Fi. And the worst part? You know this material. You've prepared. You've practiced. And yet your body is behaving like you're about to be eaten by something large and prehistoric. Why does this happen? And more importantly, what do you actually do about it? Here's what's going on under the hood. When you stand up to speak in front of people, your brain doesn't distinguish between I'm about to give a quarterly report to 12 colleagues and I am being chased by a predator and may not survive the next 4 minutes. It activates the same ancient alarm system, the fight or flight response. Adrenaline floods your bloodstream. Your heart rate spikes to push blood to your muscles. Your digestive system shuts down, which is why your stomach feels like a washing machine on spin cycle. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for complex thought, language retrieval, and coherent sentence construction, gets partially hijacked by your amygdala, which is only interested in one question: are we safe? From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes complete sense. For hundreds of thousands of years, being watched by a group of people meant either you were being judged by your tribe or you were something's dinner. Your nervous system hasn't gotten the memo that the audience in front of you just wants a good presentation. Now here's the insight that changes everything, and it comes from a landmark study by psychologist Alison Wood Brooks at Harvard Business School. She took a group of people who were terrified of public speaking and split them into two groups. Before they had to speak, one group was told to say to themselves, "I am calm." The other group was told to say, "I am excited." The results were remarkable. The people who told themselves they were excited performed dramatically better. They were rated as more persuasive, more competent, and more confident. Not the ones who tried to calm down. Why? Because nervousness and excitement are physiologically almost identical states. Same heart rate, same adrenaline, same heightened alertness. The only difference is the story you're telling yourself about what that feeling means. When you label it as fear, you frame the situation as a threat. When you label it as excitement, you frame it as an opportunity. And your brain responds to the frame, not just the chemistry. This is called reappraisal, and it's one of the most powerful tools in the speaker's toolkit. The next time you feel that surge before speaking, don't fight it. Don't try to slow your breathing down to a meditative crawl and pretend you're relaxed when you're clearly not. Instead, say the words out loud if you can, or at least in your head, "I'm excited." Because you are. Something important is about to happen. You have something to say. And your body is preparing to deliver it at full power. That physical charge you're feeling isn't weakness, it's energy. Your job isn't to eliminate it. Your job is to channel it. There's another technique worth building into your pre-speech routine, and it comes from social psychologist Amy Cuddy, whose research on body language showed that holding an expansive, open posture, what she calls a power pose, for just 2 minutes before speaking can measurably shift your hormonal state, increasing testosterone and decreasing cortisol. Stand tall, take up space, breathe deeply into your belly. You don't have to do this in front of anyone. Do it in a bathroom stall, in a hallway, in your car before you walk in. What you're doing is sending a signal from your body to your brain, not the other way around. You're not waiting to feel confident before you stand tall. You're standing tall so that you start to feel confident. The body leads, and the mind follows. And finally, there's the single most underrated shift you can make in how you approach any speaking situation, and it has nothing to do with technique. It has to do with focus. Most speakers who struggle are focused almost entirely on themselves. How do I look? Am I making sense? Did I just lose my train of thought? Are they judging me? This inward spiral is the real enemy. The cure is to redirect your attention completely outward, toward the audience. Ask yourself, what do these people need from this conversation? The moment you become genuinely interested in being useful to the people in front of you, the self-consciousness starts to dissolve. Because you can't be truly focused on two things at once. And service is a far more powerful place to speak from than performance. Structure: how to build a speech nobody can forget. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Think about a speech, a talk, or a presentation you actually remember, not just that it was good, but that you remember what was in it. The ideas, the examples, maybe even specific lines. Now ask yourself, why do you remember that one, when you've probably sat through hundreds of presentations in your life and can't recall a single thing for most of them? It's not because the speaker was more intelligent. It's not because the topic was inherently more interesting. It's almost always because of one thing: structure. The way information is organized determines whether it sticks or evaporates. And most speakers, even experienced ones, get this completely wrong. The most common mistake is what I call the brain dump approach. The speaker knows a lot about their topic, they're genuinely passionate about it, and so they try to fit everything they know into the time they've been given. They move from point to point, adding detail after detail, covering every angle, and by the end of the talk, the audience is completely full, in the worst possible way. Like a meal where every dish arrived at the same time and nothing had seasoning. The problem isn't the content. The problem is that the human brain doesn't absorb information in bulk. It absorbs it through contrast, sequence, tension, and resolution. In other words, through narrative logic, not encyclopedic logic. So let's talk about how to actually build a speech that lands. The first principle is what communication researchers call the rule of three. Across virtually every culture and every type of communication, from ancient rhetoric to modern advertising, ideas delivered in groups of three are consistently easier to remember and more persuasive than any other number. Julius Caesar didn't say, "I came, I saw, I conquered, and also I reorganized the local administration." Lincoln's address didn't promise a nation of 4 or 5 things. Steve Jobs didn't introduce one more thing and then list 8 features. 3 is the magic number because it's the minimum needed to create a pattern, and patterns are what memory latches onto. When you're building your talk, identify your 3 core ideas, not 7, not 10, 3, and build everything else around them. The second structural principle is the concept of the spine, a single, clear sentence that captures the entire purpose of your talk. Not your topic, your purpose. Your topic might be leadership during change. But your spine might be, the leaders who thrive in uncertainty are the ones who are honest about what they don't know. Every anecdote, every statistic, every example you include should connect back to that spine. If it doesn't belong in the talk, no matter how interesting it is. Screenwriters call this killing your darlings, and it applies just as much to speeches. Clarity of purpose is the most undervalued structural tool available to any speaker, because it forces you to make decisions about what stays and what goes, and that editing process is where most speeches either become great or stay mediocre. The third principle is one borrowed from the world of storytelling, and it's called the problem-solution arc. Human brains are wired to follow tension toward resolution. We're not wired to follow a list of facts. So instead of structuring your talk as "here are 5 things I want to tell you," structure it as "here is a problem that exists in the world, and here's what I've discovered about how to solve it." This works whether you're giving a keynote at a conference, pitching a business idea, or presenting a project update to your team. Open with the problem in a way that makes the audience feel it, not just understand it. Then take them on a journey toward the answer. The information you deliver along the way becomes meaningful because it's in service of resolving something they care about. Let's make this concrete. Imagine 2 speakers both giving a 20-minute talk on the importance of sleep. Speaker A opens with, "Tonight I'm going to share 7 facts about sleep deprivation and its effects on productivity." Speaker B opens with, "Most of us are walking around every day operating at roughly 60% of our actual cognitive capacity, and we think that's just normal." It's not. And the fix is simpler than anything you'll read in a productivity book. Both speakers have the same information. But Speaker B has created a problem the audience now needs resolved. They're leaning forward before the first data point has even been mentioned. The structure creates the engagement, the content then rewards it. One more structural technique that separates good speakers from great ones, the callback. This is the practice of returning to something introduced early in your talk, a story, an image, a question, a specific phrase, and bringing it back at the end with new meaning. It creates a feeling of completeness, of satisfying symmetry, that audiences respond to almost viscerally. If you opened your talk with a story about a conversation you had with your father when you were 12, and your closing somehow circles back to that same conversation with a new layer of meaning, you haven't just ended your speech. You've closed a loop that the audience didn't even know was open. And that's the kind of ending people talk about afterward. Structure isn't a constraint on creativity. It's the thing that makes creativity land. A brilliant idea delivered in a confusing order is just a confusing idea. The same brilliant idea, delivered through a clear spine, built on 3 pillars, moving through a problem-solution arc, and closing with a callback, that's a talk people remember 6 months later. Storytelling. Why stories are the most powerful weapon a speaker has. In 2010, a graduate student at Stanford named Chip Heath conducted a simple experiment with his class. He asked students to give 1-minute persuasive speeches on whether or not nonviolent crime was a serious problem in America. Some students used statistics. Some told personal stories. Some mixed both. Then, 10 minutes after all the speeches were done, Heath asked the class to write down everything they could remember from what they'd heard. The results were staggering. Only 5% of students remembered a specific statistic from any speech. But 63% remembered a story. Same room, same topic, same amount of time, and stories were retained at more than 12 times the rate of data. That experiment didn't just make a point about memory. It revealed something fundamental about how human beings actually process and absorb information. Here's the neuroscience behind why this happens, because understanding it will change the way you think about every presentation you ever give. When you hear a list of facts or a sequence of abstract concepts, only the language processing regions of your brain activate, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, responsible for decoding words and syntax. You understand the information, but you don't feel it. Now when you hear a story, especially a story with sensory detail, conflict, and a human being at its center, something entirely different happens. Your motor cortex lights up if the story involves movement. Your sensory cortex activates if there's texture, smell, or sound described. Your emotional centers fire in response to the character's experiences. Researchers call this neural coupling. The listener's brain literally begins to mirror the brain activity of the storyteller. You're not just transferring information. You're transferring an experience. And experiences, unlike bullet points, are almost impossible to forget. So how do you actually use this in a talk? The first thing to understand is the anatomy of a good story. Every effective story, from a 30-second anecdote to a 2-hour film, contains the same basic elements. There's a character, and we need to care about them. There's a world they inhabit, described with just enough detail to feel real. There's a moment where something disrupts that world, a challenge, a decision, a failure, a discovery. And there's a resolution that carries meaning beyond just "and then it worked out." Notice what's not on that list: impressive vocabulary, dramatic delivery, or a story that ends in triumph. Some of the most powerful stories speakers ever tell are about the times they got it completely wrong. Vulnerability in storytelling is not weakness, it's the mechanism of connection. When you stand in front of an audience and tell a story about a time you were humiliated, confused, afraid, or wrong, you do something that no statistic can ever do. You make people feel less alone. Brené Brown, who has spent decades studying human connection, built an entire career and one of the most watched TED Talks in history on this single insight. When you share something real and imperfect about your own experience, the audience doesn't think less of you. They trust you more. Because they recognize you as human, the same way they are, rather than as a performer presenting a curated version of competence. There's a specific type of story that works especially well in speeches, and it's what screenwriting coaches call the crucible moment, a moment in your life where you were under pressure and something essential about you was revealed or changed. These don't have to be dramatic. They don't require near-death experiences or life-altering catastrophes. The moment you realized your entire approach to management was wrong after a conversation with a junior employee. The first time you failed publicly and discovered you could survive it. The afternoon you sat in a parking lot for 20 minutes before a sales call because you were so afraid, and then went in anyway. These moments are crucibles because they contain transformation, and transformation is what audiences are always, consciously or not, looking for permission to experience themselves. Now, a word about specificity, because this is where most amateur storytellers lose their audience. Vague stories don't work. I once had a difficult client tells us nothing. I once had a client who called me at 11:45 on a Thursday night to tell me he'd shown my proposal to his wife and she hated the color scheme. Now we're somewhere. Specificity is not decoration. It is the mechanism of believability. When you give a precise detail, a time, a name, a color, a number, a physical sensation, the brain registers it as real. It says, this person was actually there. Whereas vague generalities activate the brain's skepticism. Your stories should have enough specific detail that the audience can see them, not just hear them. One powerful technique for building storytelling into a talk that isn't primarily narrative, like a data-heavy business presentation, is what I call the human hinge. This is the practice of introducing every major point with a brief human story before you bring in the evidence. So instead of saying research shows that employee recognition increases productivity by 23%, you say, a few years ago I visited a warehouse outside of Chicago where the manager had started writing handwritten notes to his team, just a few lines, once a week. I want to tell you what happened to that team over the next 6 months. You've opened a door. Now the statistic becomes the satisfying answer to a question the audience is already asking. The story does the emotional work. The data does the intellectual work. Together they're far more persuasive than either would be alone. Finally, remember that the best story you can tell is almost always the one only you can tell. Not the most polished, not the most dramatic, the most specific to your actual lived experience. Because in a world full of speakers who borrow other people's quotes and recycle other people's examples, the person who stands up and says this happened to me, and here's what it actually felt like is immediately and unmistakably different. Your story is your fingerprint. And no one in that room has seen that fingerprint before. Delivery, voice, body, and the art of silence. There's a famous study from the 1960s by psychologist Albert Mehrabian that gets misquoted constantly. People cite it to claim that 93% of communication is nonverbal, that only 7% of what you say actually matters, and everything else is body language and tone. That's not exactly what Mehrabian found, and the real picture is more nuanced. But the core insight holds up under decades of subsequent research. When there is a conflict between what someone says and how they say it, audiences overwhelmingly believe the how. You can say, "I'm thrilled to be here," in a flat, defeated monotone while staring at your shoes, and every single person in the room will know you are not thrilled to be here. Conversely, you can deliver a fairly ordinary idea with genuine physical presence and vocal energy, and people will leave the room feeling like they heard something important. Delivery is not packaging. Delivery is meaning. Let's start with the voice, because it is the most versatile and most underused instrument a speaker has. Most people treat their voice like a car they only ever drive in first gear, functional, consistent, and completely incapable of taking anyone anywhere interesting. But your voice has at least 5 distinct dimensions you can consciously control, and each one does something different in the listener's brain. The first is pace, how fast or slow you speak. Speaking quickly creates a sense of urgency and excitement. Speaking slowly signals importance, weight, and confidence. The mistake most nervous speakers make is speaking at a constant pace throughout their entire talk, which creates a kind of auditory flatline. The most effective speakers vary their pace deliberately, accelerating through background information to show it's familiar territory, then slowing almost to a crawl when they arrive at the point they most want to land. The second dimension is pitch, the highness or lowness of your voice. Pitch rises naturally when you're excited or uncertain, and drops when you're making a definitive statement. One of the most damaging habits a speaker can have is called upspeak, ending declarative sentences with a rising inflection, as if every statement is actually a question. So we increased revenue by 30%? That rising tone tells your audience you're not sure they'll accept what you're saying, which immediately undermines your authority. Practice ending your key statements with a downward inflection. It doesn't mean being aggressive or flat, it means sounding like someone who believes what they're saying. The third dimension is volume, and this one is about more than just being loud enough to be heard. Strategic drops in volume are one of the most powerful tools in live speaking. When you suddenly get quieter, genuinely quieter, almost conspiratorial, audiences lean in. They become more attentive, not less, because the brain interprets a drop in volume as a signal that something significant is about to be said. Think of it as the vocal equivalent of pulling someone close to tell them a secret. The intimacy created by a lowered voice can make a single sentence feel more important than 10 sentences delivered at full volume. Conversely, a sudden increase in volume after a quiet passage creates a jolt of energy that snaps attention back if you feel the room drifting. Now let's talk about the element that terrifies speakers more than almost any other: silence. The pause. That empty, yawning gap between sentences where nothing is happening, and every untrained speaker's instinct is to fill it with something, anything, an an ah, a nervous laugh, the word so, or the phrase "you know what I mean." Here's what you need to understand about silence in a speech. The audience experiences it completely differently than you do. When you pause for 3 seconds after a powerful statement, it feels to you like an eternity, like the whole room is waiting for you to rescue them from the void. But to the audience, that same 3 seconds feels like a gift. It feels like time to absorb what was just said. It signals that you believe what you just said is worth thinking about. Silence is confidence made audible. And is the sound of someone who doesn't yet trust silence. The fix for filler words is not complicated, but it requires practice. It's simply this: when you feel the urge to fill a gap with sound, choose silence instead. Not forever, just for the moment. Take a breath. Let the thought land. Then continue. This feels incredibly uncomfortable at first, which is exactly why most people never do it. But once you've experienced the way a room responds to a well-placed pause, the visible shift in attention, the moment when you can almost watch the idea settle into people, you will never again be afraid of silence. You will start to use it the way a musician uses rests, not as absence, but as part of the composition. Body language is the other half of this equation, and the principle that governs all of it is congruence, the idea that your physical behavior should match and amplify what your words are saying, not contradict it. When speakers are nervous, their bodies do the opposite of what they need to do. They make themselves small, hunching shoulders, crossing arms, shifting weight from foot to foot, tucking their hands into their pockets. All of these are self-soothing behaviors, and the audience reads every single one of them as signals of uncertainty. The antidote is not to perform confidence you don't feel. It's to commit to stillness. Plant your feet. Stand with your weight distributed evenly. Let your arms rest naturally at your sides when you're not gesturing. The simple act of being physically still communicates more authority than almost any deliberate power move you could make, because stillness implies that you have nowhere else you need to be and nothing to prove. Gestures deserve their own attention, because done right they are enormously effective, and done wrong they are enormously distracting. The key insight is that gestures should originate from meaning, not from nerves. When you're describing something large, your hands open wide. When you're contrasting two ideas, your hands naturally move to either side of your body to represent each one. When you're making a precise, definitive point, a single finger or a clean, downward gesture lands it with authority. What you want to avoid is what coaches call gesture noise, the constant, repetitive, purposeless hand movements that happen when speakers are anxious and don't know what to do with their arms. The test for any gesture is simple. Does it add information, or does it just add movement? If it's just movement, your hands are better off still. And then there's eye contact, which is not about looking at the audience so much as it is about genuinely seeing them. There's a critical difference between scanning the room, that restless, skimming gaze that never lands anywhere long enough to make a real connection, and the practice of what speaking coaches call one thought, one person. The idea is simple: complete one full thought while looking at one specific person. Not for so long that it becomes uncomfortable, but long enough that it feels like a real human moment, like you're talking to them, not at them. Then move to someone else for the next thought. This technique does something remarkable in a large room. It makes every individual feel like the speech is being delivered personally to them. And it keeps you present, because you can't truly look at a real human face and be lost in your own anxiety at the same time. The first and last 60 seconds, how to open and close a talk so people remember you. There's a principle in cognitive psychology called the serial position effect, and it explains something every speaker needs to understand before they write a single word of their next talk. When people are exposed to a sequence of information, a list, a lecture, a presentation, they remember the items at the beginning and the items at the end with significantly greater accuracy than anything in the middle. The beginning benefits from what researchers call the primacy effect. It arrives when attention is fresh and the brain is actively trying to orient itself. The end benefits from the recency effect. It's the last thing experienced, and therefore the last thing stored before memory consolidation kicks in. Everything in between, no matter how brilliant, is fighting an uphill battle against the natural drift of human attention. This means that the most valuable real estate in any speech is not the middle, where most speakers spend 90% of their preparation time. It's the opening 60 seconds and the closing 60 seconds. Get those right, and the rest of your talk will be remembered as better than it actually was. Get them wrong, and almost nothing in between will save you. Let's start with openings, because this is where most speakers make their single biggest mistake, and it's a mistake so common that audiences have become almost immunized against it. The mistake is what I call the throat-clearing opening. It sounds like this: "Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. I'd like to start by thanking the organizing committee for putting this event together, and also my colleague Sarah who helped me prepare these slides. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is..." By the time that sentence is finished, you have used 30 seconds of your most precious attention window to say absolutely nothing. You've signaled to the audience that what's about to follow is probably going to be polite, procedural, and safe. And the human brain, which is constantly asking, "Is this worth my attention?" has quietly begun to answer, "Probably not." The antidote is what speaking coaches call starting in the middle of the action. Drop the audience directly into a scene, a question, a statement, or a moment, before any context, before any introduction, before any housekeeping. Here are 4 opening types that work, and I want you to notice how each one does something different to the listener's brain in the first 5 seconds. The first is the provocative question, not a rhetorical formality, but a genuine question the audience hasn't considered before. How many of you have apologized today for something you're not actually sorry for? That question creates instant self-reflection. The audience is no longer passive. They're inside the talk before they've decided to be. The second is the bold, counterintuitive statement, something that contradicts what the audience expects to hear. Everything you've been told about building good habits is making your habits worse. That statement creates cognitive dissonance, and the brain's immediate response to dissonance is attention. It wants to resolve the contradiction. The third opening type is the sensory story, dropping immediately into a specific scene with vivid physical detail. Not "I want to tell you about a moment that changed my thinking," but "It was 4 a.m. and I was sitting on the floor of an airport in Frankfurt with a dead phone, no charger, and a connecting flight I'd already missed." You're in a scene. You're with that person on the floor. You want to know what happens next. The fourth type is the striking statistic, but only if it's framed as a human problem rather than a data point. Not studies show that 40% of workers feel disengaged. But right now, as you're sitting in this room, roughly 4 out of every 10 people on your team are doing their jobs while secretly wondering if any of it matters. 4 out of 10. That's not an HR problem. That's a leadership emergency. The statistic is the same. But one version gives you a number and one version gives you a feeling. Only one of them opens a talk. Now here's a technique for the opening that very few speakers use, and it's devastatingly effective when done well. It's called the planted question, and it works like this. In your opening, you introduce a question, an image, or an unresolved story that you deliberately do not answer immediately. You let it hang in the air. I'm going to come back to that story in about 40 minutes, and when I do, I think you're going to see everything we've talked about tonight in a completely different way. What you've just done is installed a hook in the audience's mind, a small, persistent pull of curiosity that keeps them engaged through the entire middle section of your talk, because they're waiting for the resolution. Mystery is one of the most ancient and reliable engagement mechanisms in human communication. Screenwriters call it the open loop. Good novelists call it the unanswered question. In a speech, it's the invisible thread that connects your opening to your close. And now the close, which is, if anything, even more important than the opening, because it's the last thing your audience takes with them when they walk out of the room. The close is your final act of compression. You are distilling everything you've said into its most essential form, and then you're delivering it with everything you have. The two cardinal sins of closing a speech are, first, ending on a logistical note. So, that's all I have. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Again, thank you for having me. And second, the endless false ending, where you seem to conclude 3 or 4 times before actually stopping, like a song that keeps doing fake outros. Both of these endings do the same damage. They bleed the energy out of the room at precisely the moment you most need to amplify it. A close that works does one of several things. It can deliver the resolution to the open loop you created in your introduction, the answer to the planted question, the end of the story you began. This creates that feeling of satisfying completeness, of a circle closing, that audiences find almost physically satisfying. It can issue a specific, concrete call to action, not a vague "I hope this inspired you to think differently," but tomorrow morning, before you open your email, write down one conversation you've been avoiding. Just the name. Then make it happen this week. Specificity in a call to action is the difference between inspiration that evaporates in the parking lot and change that actually happens on Tuesday morning. Or your close can land a single, carefully crafted line, the kind that sounds simple but carries the weight of everything you've just said. A line people will write in their notebooks, quote to their colleagues, and still remember 2 years later. The way to find that line is to ask yourself, if your audience remembers only one sentence from this talk, what do you want it to be? Write that sentence first. Then build your entire close around delivering it at maximum impact. Give it space before and after. Let it arrive in silence. Say it slowly. And then, and this is critical, stop. Don't add anything after your most powerful line. Don't explain it, don't qualify it, don't follow it with "so anyway." Let it be the last thing they hear. Because the most confident thing a speaker can do is trust that their final word is enough, and simply sit down. Preparation and rehearsal, how professional speakers actually get ready. There's a story about Tiger Woods that his first coach, Rudy Duran, used to tell. When Tiger was about 4 years old, he would spend hours on the practice range hitting the same shot over and over, not randomly, but with complete intention, adjusting something small each time, studying the result, adjusting again. He wasn't practicing to get through practice. He was practicing to solve a specific problem. And Duran would say that what separated Tiger from every other talented child he'd ever worked with wasn't the number of hours, it was the quality of attention inside those hours. The same principle applies to public speaking, and it explains why some speakers can rehearse a talk 20 times and still feel underprepared, while others rehearse it 5 times and walk on stage with complete ownership of the material. It's not about the quantity of preparation. It's about what kind of preparation you're actually doing. The first thing to understand is the difference between 2 types of practice that feel similar from the outside but produce completely different results. The first type is what psychologist Anders Ericsson called naive practice, going through the motions repeatedly without specific focus on what needs to improve. This is the speaker who reads through their slides 7 times the night before a presentation and mistakes familiarity with readiness. Familiarity and readiness are not the same thing. Familiarity means you know what's coming next when everything goes according to plan. Readiness means you can handle everything that doesn't. The second type is what Erickson called deliberate practice, focused, uncomfortable, specifically designed to push the edges of your current ability. This is where actual skill is built. It requires identifying your weakest point, isolating it, and working on it directly, not warming up on the parts you're already good at. So what does deliberate practice look like for a speaker? It starts with a principle that most people find deeply uncomfortable. You must practice out loud, on your feet, at full volume, from the very beginning of your preparation. Not in your head. Not by reading your notes quietly at a desk. Out loud. The reason this feels uncomfortable is the same reason it's necessary, because speaking is a physical act, not just a cognitive one. The muscles in your jaw, your diaphragm, your larynx need to rehearse the same way a pianist's fingers need to rehearse. The neural pathways that connect your thoughts to your words to your breath are built through physical repetition, not mental review. When you practice only in your head, you're essentially rehearsing a different activity than the one you'll actually be performing. There's a specific practice technique used by many professional speakers that most amateurs never discover, and it's called chunking. Instead of always rehearsing your talk from beginning to end, you break it into discrete sections: the opening, the first transition, the key story in the middle, the closing, and you practice each chunk independently until it reaches a level of fluency where you could deliver it under any circumstances. Then you practice the transitions between chunks, because the transition is almost always where speakers lose their thread. Then you put it all together. This approach has two significant advantages over full run-throughs. First, it makes the practice sessions more targeted. You can spend 10 minutes on the section that needs work rather than running the whole 40-minute talk every time. Second, it builds what performers call anchor points, moments in the talk where you know you're completely solid, and which give you something to navigate back to if you lose your place. The question of how much to memorize versus how much to improvise is one that divides speaking coaches, and the honest answer is that both extremes are dangerous. Memorizing a talk word for word creates a brittleness that can be catastrophic. If you lose your place, there's nothing to fall back on because you haven't been thinking, you've been reciting. But going in with only a loose outline and assuming you'll find the words in the moment is a gamble that works for experienced improvisers and almost no one else. The sweet spot, which most professional speakers converge on, is what I'd call fluent flexibility. You know your key points deeply enough that you could explain each one in 3 different ways without thinking about it. You know your stories well enough that their details are vivid and reliable, and you know your opening and closing almost word for word, because those are the moments that most benefit from precision. Everything in between has room to breathe, to adapt to the audience, to respond to what's happening in the room. One of the most powerful and most avoided preparation tools is video. Recording yourself and watching it back. Most speakers refuse to do this because watching yourself on video is an experience that ranges from uncomfortable to genuinely distressing. You notice every filler word, every awkward gesture, every moment where your energy drops. And that discomfort is precisely why it works. You cannot fix what you cannot see, and without video, you are entirely dependent on your own internal sense of how you're coming across, which is almost always significantly more flattering than reality. Professional speakers, actors, and athletes use video review as a standard part of their preparation not because they enjoy it, but because it compresses the feedback loop. What might take years of performing to notice through audience reactions, you can identify in 20 minutes of watching yourself on a $5 phone camera. Film 1 practice run per preparation cycle. Watch it once with the sound off to evaluate your body language and physical presence. Watch it again with the sound to evaluate your pace, clarity, and filler words. Write down 2 things to fix. Fix them in the next run through. There's also the matter of the environment you're practicing in, and this is something almost nobody thinks about. Practicing in your living room, sitting in a chair, speaking at conversational volume, is not remotely the same neurological experience as standing in front of 30 people in a conference room under fluorescent lights with a clicker in your hand. The more you can close the gap between your practice environment and your performance environment, the better you will perform. If you're giving a talk in a large room, practice in a large room. If you're presenting to a board of directors across a long table, practice in a room with a table and actually stand at one end of it. If you're using a microphone, practice with something in your hand. These might seem like superficial details, but they matter because performance anxiety is partly a physical response to an unfamiliar environment, and every element of familiarity you can build in advance reduces the load on your nervous system when it counts. Finally, there is one preparation tool that no amount of solo rehearsal can fully replace, and that is practice in front of actual human beings before the real performance. Not your supportive partner who will tell you it was wonderful no matter what. Not your best friend who laughs at all your jokes. A small group of people who will give you honest, specific feedback, ideally people who are similar to your actual target audience. There is a physiological shift that happens when you move from practicing alone to speaking in front of people, even just 2 or 3 people in a living room, and the only way to get comfortable with that shift is to experience it repeatedly in low-stakes situations. Toastmasters has built an entire global organization around this single insight, that the most effective preparation for public speaking is public speaking. Not reading about public speaking. Not watching talks about public speaking. Getting up, repeatedly, in front of human faces, and learning to stay present. Every time you do it, the neurological cost of doing it decreases. Not because it stops being challenging, but because your system has proof that you've survived it before. Reading the room and handling the unexpected. There is a version of public speaking that exists only in preparation, the version where every slide loads perfectly, every transition lands exactly as rehearsed, the audience is attentive and warm, the microphone works, and the talk unfolds like a piece of clockwork you spent weeks building. And then there's public speaking as it actually exists in the real world, where the projector dies 3 minutes in, where someone in the 3rd row is visibly checking their phone, where a question from the audience completely blindsides you, where the room's energy is so flat it feels like you're speaking into a mattress, where you lose your place in the middle of your most important story and the silence that follows feels less like a powerful pause and more like a small personal catastrophe. The difference between a good speaker and a truly exceptional one has almost nothing to do with how they perform when everything goes right. It has everything to do with how they respond when things go wrong. And things always go wrong. Let's start with the most fundamental skill in live communication, reading the room. This is the ability to perceive, in real time, what the audience is actually experiencing and adjust your delivery accordingly. It sounds obvious, and yet the vast majority of speakers, particularly when they're nervous or over-rehearsed, are effectively sealed inside their own performance. They're monitoring themselves, their own pace, their own transitions, their own progress through the material, rather than monitoring the most important source of feedback available to them, the actual human being sitting in front of them. Reading the room means making the audience your primary instrument panel. You're watching for microsignals, the slight forward lean that tells you a story is landing, the collective stillness that tells you an idea is genuinely landing in people's minds, the subtle restlessness that tells you attention is starting to drift, the crossed arms and furrowed brows that tell you something you said has created resistance. These signals are always there. They're broadcasting constantly. Most speakers are just too focused on themselves to receive them. When you notice the room drifting, and you will, if you're paying attention, the instinct is to work harder, speak louder, move faster, add more emphasis. Almost always, the right move is the counterintuitive one. Slow down. Drop your volume. Ask a question. Change the physical dynamic entirely. Some of the best recoveries I've ever seen a speaker make came from simply stopping, looking at the audience, and saying something like, "I want to check in with you for a second. Does this connect with what you're actually dealing with in your work?" That single act of genuine engagement can reset the energy of an entire room, because it does something most audiences rarely experience. It treats them as participants rather than recipients. The talk stops being something happening at them and becomes something happening with them. Audiences respond to that shift almost immediately. One of the most feared moments in any speaking situation is the question and answer session, and it's feared for good reason, because it's the one part of the talk you genuinely cannot script. Questions can be hostile, irrelevant, incomprehensibly long, or so sharp that they expose a gap in your argument you didn't know was there. The first principle for handling Q&A well is to stop thinking of it as a test and start thinking of it as a conversation. A test is something you pass or fail. A conversation is something you participate in honestly. When someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to, the most authoritative thing you can say, far more authoritative than guessing, deflecting, or drowning the question in tangential information, is, "I don't know the answer to that, but here's how I'd think about finding it," or simply, "That's outside my area of expertise, and I'd rather point you to someone who knows it better than give you a bad answer." Audiences don't expect you to be omniscient. They do expect you to be honest. And intellectual honesty in the face of a hard question builds more credibility than a confident-sounding non-answer ever could. For hostile questions, and they happen, especially in high-stakes business or political contexts, there's a technique that experienced speakers use that works almost every time. It's called acknowledge and redirect. The structure is simple. You begin by genuinely acknowledging the concern or perspective embedded in the question, without agreeing with its premise and without becoming defensive. That's a real tension, and I don't want to pretend it isn't. Then you redirect toward the aspect of the question you can address most constructively. What you're doing is separating the person from the position. You're showing the room that you can hear challenge without being destabilized by it, which is one of the clearest signals of genuine authority a speaker can give. What you absolutely must not do is become visibly rattled, dismissive, or sarcastic. The audience is watching how you respond to pressure far more than they're evaluating whether your answer is technically correct. Technical failures deserve their own chapter in any speaker's preparation, because they will happen to you, probably at the worst possible moment. The projector will freeze. The video won't play. The clicker battery will die. The microphone will squeal with feedback at the exact moment you're making your most important point. Professional speakers develop what I'd call a graceful contingency mindset, the deep-seated understanding that they are the talk, not the slides. The slides are a visual aid. The clicker is a convenience. The microphone is amplification. When any of these fail, the talk continues, because the talk lives in you. The practical implication of this mindset is that you should always know your material well enough to deliver it with nothing, no slides, no notes, no technology of any kind. Not because you'll necessarily have to, but because knowing you can removes the fragility. When you're not dependent on your slides to remember what to say next, a slide failure becomes a minor inconvenience rather than a derailing crisis. And the calm with which you handle it, the slight smile, the easy pivot, the let's keep going while the tech gets sorted, communicates more about your competence than any slide you could have shown. There's also the specific challenge of speaking to an audience that is colder, more skeptical, or less engaged than you expected, and this requires a different kind of adjustment than simply losing the room partway through. Cold audiences are often cold for reasons that have nothing to do with you. They may have had 3 back-to-back sessions before yours. They may have just come from difficult news. They may be in a culture or professional context where visible enthusiasm is considered unprofessional. The mistake is to interpret their stillness as rejection and respond by becoming either more aggressive in your energy or more apologetic in your manner. Neither works. What works is warmth without neediness, continuing to speak as if you're having the most natural conversation in the world, finding moments of genuine humor that invite rather than demand a response, and making the audience feel safe enough to engage at their own pace. Cold rooms warm up. But they warm up to speakers who are patient and secure, not to speakers who are visibly anxious about the temperature. And then there are the unexpected interruptions, the person who talks over you, the phone that rings loudly at your most delicate moment, the fire alarm that clears the building mid-presentation. The principle governing all of these is the same. Your response to the interruption becomes part of the talk. The audience will remember how you handled it. A speaker who responds to a disruption with grace, humor, and unshaken composure doesn't just survive the moment. They often emerge from it more connected to the audience than they were before, because they've revealed something real about themselves under pressure. One of the most effective responses to almost any unexpected interruption is simple, genuine humor, not a prepared joke, but an honest, spontaneous acknowledgement of the absurdity of the moment. Laughter is the fastest reset available in a live speaking situation. It releases tension, it signals confidence, and it reminds everyone in the room, including you, that this is ultimately a human experience, not a surgical procedure, and it will be okay. The deepest skill underlying all of this, reading rooms, handling questions, surviving failures, managing cold audiences, is what psychologists call present moment awareness. It's the capacity to be genuinely here, in this room, with these people, right now, rather than in your head managing a parallel conversation about how it's going. Actors train for years to develop this quality. Athletes call it being in the zone. For speakers, it's the difference between performing a talk and truly giving one. And it cannot be rehearsed into existence from the outside. It can only be cultivated from the inside, by making a genuine decision each time you stand up to speak. I am going to be here. Not in my notes, not in my anxiety, not in the imagined judgment of the audience. Here. Present. Responsive. Ready for whatever this room brings. That decision, made consistently, is what turns a prepared speaker into a truly alive one. Your voice matters. We've covered a lot of ground together. We've talked about the neuroscience of fear and how to reframe it as fuel. We've broken down the architecture of a speech that sticks, the spine, the 3 pillars, the problem-solution arc, the callback. We've explored why stories bypass the logical brain and land directly in the part of us that feels and remembers. We've gone deep into the mechanics of delivery, the voice, the body, the pause, the power of genuine stillness. We've examined the most valuable 60 seconds on either end of a talk, and why most speakers squander them on politeness instead of impact. We've looked at how professionals actually prepare, not by reading slides quietly to themselves the night before, but through deliberate, physical, out-loud practice that builds real fluency. And we've explored what happens when the room doesn't cooperate, when the technology fails, when the audience pushes back, and why your response to those moments reveals more about your capability than anything you rehearsed. That's a significant body of knowledge. But knowledge, on its own, changes nothing. Here is the uncomfortable truth that every great speaker eventually has to reckon with. There is no amount of information about public speaking that substitutes for the experience of actually doing it. You can watch every TED Talk ever recorded. You can read every book on rhetoric and persuasion. You can memorize every technique in this video word for word. And you will still feel nervous the first time you stand up in front of a room. The second time too, probably. Maybe the 10th time. Because speaking in public is not a puzzle to be solved intellectually, it is a skill to be built physically, incrementally, through repeated exposure to the very discomfort you're trying to overcome. The path through the fear is not around it. It is directly through it. And every single person who speaks with genuine power and presence today has simply walked through that door more times than the people who haven't. What I want to leave you with is something that gets lost in most conversations about public speaking, in the obsession with technique and structure and delivery mechanics. And it's this: the reason all of this matters is not performance. It's not about becoming slicker, more polished, or more impressive to look at. It's about something far more fundamental. Every one of us has ideas that deserve to be heard. Every one of us has experiences that could change the way someone else sees their situation. Every one of us has, at some point, sat in a room where a decision was being made and said nothing, not because we had nothing to say, but because we didn't trust that how we said it would match the importance of what we felt. and so the idea stayed inside. The story went untold. The room made a worse decision because one of the people in it stayed quiet. That cost is real. It happens every day, in boardrooms and classrooms and community meetings and dinner tables, and most of us have paid it more times than we'd like to admit. Public speaking, at its best, is an act of generosity. It is the decision to take something that matters to you, an idea, a discovery, a conviction, a story, and offer it to other people in a form they can actually receive. That requires skill, yes. It requires preparation and structure and the courage to stand still in front of human faces while your nervous system insists this is dangerous. But underneath all the technique, what it really requires is the belief that what you have to say is worth the discomfort of saying it. And I want to tell you directly, it is. Your perspective is specific to you. Your experience of the world is one that nobody else has had. Your voice, developed and directed and trusted, can do things in a room that no slide deck, no email, no report ever could. It can shift how people feel about a problem. It can make someone in the back row feel seen for the first time in months. It can change a decision, launch a movement, or simply remind a tired audience that someone in the room gives a damn. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the most powerful things one human being can do for another. So here's what I want you to do after this video ends. Not someday. Not when you feel ready, because the feeling of readiness is something that arrives after the action, not before it. I want you to find one opportunity in the next 7 days to speak when you could have stayed silent. It doesn't have to be a keynote. It doesn't have to be a formal presentation. It could be speaking up in a meeting where you usually keep your thoughts to yourself. It could be offering a toast at dinner that actually says something true. It could be signing up for a local Toastmasters session or volunteering to present at your next team stand-up. One moment, in the next 7 days, where you choose your voice over your comfort. Because every great speaker you have ever admired started exactly there, not on a stage, not with a microphone, not with a perfectly structured talk, but with a single decision to say the thing they had to say, in front of the people who needed to hear it, before they felt completely ready. The room is waiting. You have something to say. Go say it.